Well, when the entire energy resource life cycle is taken into account, turns out nuclear power safety record is unmatched by any other energy resource.
Hello, everyone. Rebecca Terrell reporting for the New American Magazine. We all know the old maxim that the only things certain in life are death and taxes. Or you could say that another way. There's risk associated with everything. We know we run a risk of having our identity stolen when we are online, but we do it anyway. We take a chance every time we get out on the interstate where we could be involved in an accident. That doesn't stop us from taking road trips. Some federal agencies exist to supposedly remove all risk to all Americans, which is either a naive dream or a deliberate lie. Take OSHA, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which since the 1970s has been holding American business owners to impossibly high standards for making their workplaces 100% risk-free for their employees. They face exorbitant fines, even for things like closed front toilet seats. A recent issue of the New American Magazine includes an article on this topic, so be sure to check that out on our website at thenewamerican.com. But not before you hear what my guest today has to say about the topic of risk and the importance of understanding it. Why? Because our societal misunderstanding of it is enslaving us to a bureaucratic leviathan that's using our ignorance to keep us shackled in industry and education and banking, you name it, and especially in the area of energy independence. My guest I mentioned is Jeffrey Mahn, and he is a retired nuclear engineer who has worked in various capacities in the nuclear power industry as well as at Sandia National Laboratories on the U.S. Nuclear Weapons Program. He now volunteers as an educator with the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Jeff, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to discuss these important issues.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, let's start with the big question. What is risk and how should it be understood? Why is it important to understand it?
Good question, and a very important question. To understand risk, we actually need to work with two terms. First one is hazard. Hazard is something with the potential to cause harm, and a risk is actually the likelihood of harm occurring. So there are certain principles of risk management that must be acknowledged up front in any discussion of risk. And let me go through those fairly quickly. Number one, everything has hazards and all hazards have risk. Second one, risks are not equally consequential. There are two components to risk. There's the consequence severity and the probability of occurrence, and both must be evaluated to assess risk. Next, humans lack omniscience. In other words, some risks will not be known. Humans also lack precognition, meaning some risks will not be foreseen. Human resources are limited, which means that resources available to control risks are also limited. Something is safe only to the degree that its risks are quote unquote acceptable. There is no absolute safety to anything. Recognized risk exceeding acceptability limit must be made known to those who may suffer the consequences of that risk. And probabilities of all risks are finite, meaning the bizarre or low probability mishap will occur sometime, somewhere. Risk probability calculations, although necessary for performing bona fide risk assessments, must not be afforded absolute status. Extremely low probability events can occur today, tomorrow, or next week. And in fact, they could even happen today, tomorrow, and next week. That's not likely, but neither are the other unlikely catastrophes that strike without any apparent schedule. For example, when we talk about earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, and that kind of thing. So one other maxim or principle that we also must acknowledge, this one I don't remember where I got it from or where I got the notion of it from, but I've been using it for years, and that is risk issues are emotional, solutions are technical, and decisions are political. Lastly, risk is mostly a relative quantity, which by itself is rather meaningless. So the value only makes sense when we compare it to values from other events or for the same event over a different time interval.
Right. And the danger really is that, like you said, those risk issues are emotional, which we should not let our emotions rule, because then when the decisions are made at the political level, the politicians can exploit that fear that we have of risk, that most people have of risk, and then use it to even convince us that we're responsible for things like the earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis that you mentioned that are completely out of our control. But now, supposedly, they're our fault, right? So right
Yes.
there, you see the importance of us understanding this concept of risk. So now let's talk about how to logically, not emotionally, think about risk. How is it generally expressed?
Risk is generally expressed as a combination of likelihood of occurrence and hazard consequence, generally in the form of a risk matrix. There are both qualitative and quantitative risk matrices. A qualitative one, for example, the likelihood of occurrence axis would be provided with qualitative labels such as rare, unlikely, possible, and likely, while the consequence axis would be provided with labels such as catastrophic, major, moderate, and minor. For quantitative risk assessment, each of those likelihood labels would be defined by a range of hazard frequencies, for example, frequency per year, and each consequence label would be defined by the severity of the possible hazard outcomes, for example, using maximum financial loss as a quantitative unit.
Right. And so all of these things, that's a great matrix that we've put up on the screen there. So what things influence people's understanding of risk, and how can we get them back to a less emotional way of looking at risk?
Well, probably the most significant influence on risk is what we call risk perception, which is generally driven more by the magnitude of the potential consequences than by the event likelihood of occurrence. Potentially severe consequences associated with some risks are oftentimes dissociated from an extremely low likelihood of occurrence in the minds of the general public. Complex technologies like nuclear power are generally assumed by the public to have much higher risks than are warranted, with greater potential consequences as well as greater likelihoods of occurrence. Perception is a major obstacle to effective risk communication. There is likely to be some disagreement with the notion that some risks are acceptable, and the discussions of what should be considered acceptable level of risk often raise rather high emotional passions.
Sure.
There's also the influence of risk models. There are really two types of risk models. One is a model based largely on theoretical risk using inference and extrapolation, while the other is a model based on actual risk observations. Fundamentally sound risk models should render a risk hierarchy that's based on logical analytical thinking, mitigation strategies focused on identifying root causes of risk, and mitigating action decision-making driven by informed and knowledgeable experts. But unfortunately, risk models more often than not, consist of risk hierarchies based on emotion-laden perception of risk, mitigation strategies focused on agenda-driven symptoms of risk, and mitigating action decision-making driven by, or let's say, mandated by ideology, resulting in either no risk mitigation or an unacknowledged transfer of risk to a different setting.
Right.
And risk communication is another significant influence. Generally, no distinction is made between theoretical risk and actual or real risk when communicating risk matters to the general public. Potential consequences of theoretical risks are generally modeled and therefore are heavily dependent on the assumptions underlying the risk models, whereas actual consequences of risks can be measured. And allegations of poor risk communication is often directed by the media at those alleged to be responsible for the undesired events. And the media are generally guilty of communicating unwarranted dire speculations and outright falsehoods about undesired events before the facts are actually available.
And that is so very true. And I say this as I know that I'm a journalist myself, but it's not happy good news that makes headlines. It's always the bad news, the big news that makes headlines. And so the media are very guilty of that, of stirring up this fear just it's clickbait, right? So
Hmm.
so let's talk now about how does quantifying human life. Okay, because ultimately that's what people are scared of. They're all scared of, oh, how does this affect my life? How does quantifying human life complicate risk communication, and what does that involve?
Good question. Yeah, quantification of risk is generally necessary for informed risk decision making, and it necessarily involves, therefore, the quantification of the value of a human life. And quantifying of human life is often seen as a rather callous um, endeavor. The intent is not to value human life or injury in a moral sense, but rather to assign values to life and other loss categories as a means for making social decisions. The values are not measurements, but results of decision making by society concerning the balancing of social benefit versus social risk. Um, and the problem is to assign a value to human life and to injury as well that reflects what society is willing to pay to avoid death from involuntary risk. If the value of life is not quantified, then the resources, which also have value, cannot be allocated rationally to develop and implement risk countermeasures to protect life. And if all life is given infinite value, then there's no distinction that can be made between the resources justified to protect 10 lives versus those justified to protect 10 million lives. So that's
Right.
kind of a dilemma.
It is. And you can see why it is a dilemma. So how is risk acceptability established?
Perhaps the biggest stumbling block to risk acceptability is over who has the authority to
Sure.
establish what is acceptable, because there will never be consensus on that. Determining what constitutes an acceptable level of risk is seldom without controversy and will vary depending upon one's perspective regarding the risk under discussion. And also whether risk is perceived to be voluntary or involuntary is another significant influence on that discussion. But
Sure.
generally, acceptable level of risk is determined by individuals or society at large when what they're willing to accept or tolerate in exchange for perceived benefits, or secondly, what individuals or societies are willing to accept or tolerate in order to avoid taking undesired mitigation measures or costly protective measures, or finally, what is the most acceptable or tolerable option in a decision-making activity.
Okay, so I think what you're establishing here is a framework for what we're going to talk about next. We're actually going to go to break right now, and after our break, we're going to come back and apply these principles of establishing risk acceptability to our energy independence model that we need for the United States right now. So stay with us. We'll see you right back after this break.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American Magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American Magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American Magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
Welcome back, folks. This is Rebecca Terrell reporting for the New American Magazine. And with me today is Jeffrey Mahn, retired nuclear engineer. We've been discussing risk acceptance, and now we are going to apply it to our energy models in the United States. Jeff, welcome back. And let's talk about what we should know, especially in regard to nuclear power plant risks. And the reason I'm focusing on nuclear is because our U.S. government has really shackled our nuclear. China and Russia are vastly light years ahead of us in nuclear, and the United States, as we know, is suffering from a dependence on other nations for energy sources, when nuclear could make us quite independent and never have to worry about anything like that again, right? So let's first talk about what should we know about nuclear power plant risks? Because that's the big thing. Everybody says, oh, we can't have nuclear, it's too risky.
Yeah. Well, when the entire energy resource life cycle is taken into account, turns out nuclear power safety record is unmatched by any other energy resource. Perception of nuclear power as uniquely dangerous is unfortunately reflected in the regulatory burden that's placed on our nuclear industry. The safety approach is unnecessarily geared towards everything being as low as possible, that kind of philosophy, which is reflected by both the use of the linear non-threshold dose response model, as well as the as low as reasonably achievable principle, and the continual ratcheting down of worker radiation exposure levels with no observable health benefit really sends the wrong message about the risk.
Right.
And excessively conservative regulations also add significantly to power plant operational costs. There is, in my opinion at least, an inadequate consideration of how inappropriate decisions regarding nuclear power plant risks create greater risks elsewhere. For example, the life cycle of toxic risk from using alternative energy resources.
Right. And I just want to interrupt you real quickly just to make sure that people understand the terminology we're using here. LNT refers to that, help me out here.
Linear non-threshold.
Linear,
Yeah.
no threshold, which refers to the erroneous thought that any amount of radiation is harmful. And we know that that's just simply not true, just like most of nature is not true. You can get too much sun, you can get too little sun. There is a happy medium. You can get too much vitamin A, you can get too little vitamin A. There's a happy medium. Same thing goes with radiation. So linear no threshold has been disproven time and time again, and yet our own federal bureaucracy relies on that error to form our bureaucratic regulations in nuclear. As low as reasonably achievable, which is oftentimes abbreviated ALERA, means that they are trying, based on that erroneous linear no threshold theory, to bring radiation exposure down as low as reasonably achievable, which shackles our nuclear energy. So I've interrupted you there, Jeff, but let's go on with this line of thinking. How are nuclear power plant risks evaluated? Tell about that, the plants, how they're rated.
Nuclear power plant risks are actually evaluated through the use of what we call probabilistic risk assessments.
Right.
And these are performed to provide systematic assessments of public risk associated with the operation of commercial nuclear power plants. And the PRAs use event trees and fault trees to identify and analyze power plant initiating events, safety function, performance, and accident sequences to assess the probability and consequences of not achieving a safe and stable accident outcome. So that's the primary mechanism we have for evaluating nuclear power plant risks.
Okay, and what are the outputs of that PRA?
The outputs include estimates now. They're just estimates because that's the best we can do. Even with some hard data where we have it, the best we can really do because of the models that are being used are estimates. And so the outcomes are things like reactor core damage frequency, radiological release frequencies, and radiological consequences to the general public. And again, the consequences to the general public are evaluated using that linear no threshold dose response model, which is invalid, really. And that's what causes the excessive consequences to be associated with potential nuclear power accidents.
And we see even those within the nuclear power industry bolstering this erroneous thought. For instance, out at Fukushima, they're talking now about releasing the tritiated water because the containers won't hold all the water that they need to store this what they use the word contamination, which is ridiculous. Tritium is found in water most commonly in nature. It is a very weak beta emitter. It is the radioactive isotope of hydrogen. It is not harmful to man, and yet Fukushima, the experts at Fukushima have been containing all this tritiated water. Oh, they don't have any more containment structures left. They have to release it to the ocean. Oh, this is terrible. This is horrible. No, it doesn't have. It doesn't have any effect. It doesn't have any adverse effect, right? But so you see even the nuclear power industry shooting itself in the foot, bolstering these erroneous assumptions about risk. So, okay, but back to the PRAs. What are the sources of failure probabilities used in PRAs?
Yeah, the frequency of occurrence and failure probability estimates come from essentially 4 different sources. One of which is operating experience, which provides data regarding the frequency of initiating events, the failure rates of plant equipment, and equipment repair and recovery probabilities. And a lot of that is fairly well known because we've got databases with that kind of information in them. We use expert elicitation to provide likelihood information on what we call rare event occurrences. And we also use human reliability analysis to provide information regarding the likelihood of human errors, which, again, are pretty much estimates because there's no real hard data for when it comes to human error probabilities.
Sure.
And then finally, there's common cause failure modeling that provides additional insight into failure probabilities, especially with regard to dependent equipment failures or system failures.
Okay. And let's talk now about accident consequences. How do those play a role?
Well, PRAs use probabilistic risk models that have been developed from reactor safety studies to assess the potential accident consequences. And these models assume conservatively high radioactive material release rates under severe accident conditions. And they unfortunately also apply that linear no threshold or LNT dose response model, as well as the collective dose model for predicting cancer risk fatalities. The flawed nature of the LNT model has been extensively addressed by Dr. Edward Calabrese, and the use of the collective dose model for predicting radiation-induced fatalities has been thoroughly rejected by the American Health Physics Society. And it's important to point out that there is no actual follow-up of any predicted accident public health consequences to gauge the validity of any of these PRA assumptions. In other words, when people make predictions of whether it's radiation-induced latent cancers or deaths to the general public, there's never any follow-up with any of the demographics that perhaps may have been exposed to any small amounts of radiation to ever find out whether any of them ever incur any injuries whatsoever.
Wow.
So there's nothing to ever validate the predictions. They just stay as predictions. They're nameless and faceless numbers.
Well, and on the other side of that coin, we do know that they followed up with the residents surrounding 3 Mile Island for 30 years, the state of Pennsylvania did. No, they couldn't tease out a single excess cancer death from 3 Mile Island. We know that too. We do know, we have hard factual documented evidence that the truly radioactive release products from that partial meltdown settled out within the containment structure. Isn't that right? There was nothing truly harmful ever released from the plant. We
Correct.
also know from the research done for years and decades on survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which of course was an atomic bomb, a very different thing than a nuclear power plant, I know. But we know that those who received within a certain range of radiation, not only were there no adverse health effects teased out, again, from what normally would have been expected, but you actually saw an increase in health in some of those. Is that right? Is that correct?
That's
And
correct.
you mentioned Ed Calabrese. He's done a lot of research on that with the University of Massachusetts. Isn't that right? We need to get in touch with him and get him on the show as well and get him to talk about that. But so all of that said, how realistic are PRA results?
Yeah, the use of the LNT and collective dose models in nuclear plant PRAs, in my mind at least, immediately calls into question the realism in the PRA risks.
Right.
And based on observations of both TMI, 3 Mile Island, and the Fukushima nuclear plant accidents, we found out that the probability of occurrence of some accidents is actually greater than what was assumed in the plant PRAs. The accident radiological consequences were overestimated. That is, the latent radiation-induced cancers are overestimated relative to the actual observations. Again, this is the linear no threshold model problem. The effects of unwarranted public evacuations are actually more damaging to the general public health than a radiation release from a reactor core melt accident. We had a reactor core melt accident, both 3 Mile Island and Fukushima as well. And the NRC, because of these observations, the NRC has conducted a state-of-the-art consequence analysis and published the findings of that in 2012, and concluded from that study that the latent cancer fatality risk from nuclear plant accidents is millions of times lower than the general cancer fatality risk in the United States from all cancer causes, even assuming the linear no threshold dose response model.
Wow. Good
So
heavens.
the unrealistic estimations of public health consequences have driven, unfortunately, many complex regulations for nuclear power plants to prevent very unlikely events that could release less than harmful levels of or amounts of radioactive material. And of course, these regulations have hugely increased the costs of nuclear plant construction and operation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, so what level of risk should a nuclear plant be designed for? And it's my understanding that it would take a whole lot to breach a nuclear power plant.
Yes, any discussion of what level of risk nuclear power plants should be designed for necessarily involves consideration of what we call two types of accidents that are evaluated in a plant's safety documentation basis. And one is called the design basis accident, which is any credible operational or non-operational plant event for which preventive, protective, and or mitigative safety measures are provided in the plant design. We also have a category called beyond design basis accident, which is an operational or non-operational event for which no formal risk analysis needs to be performed, and there are no specific risk mitigating measures required, but they are required to address these kinds of things to say, okay, here's what these are about, and here's what we consider to be the likelihood of one of these kinds of things happening. Here are the maximum potential consequences that could possibly occur from one of these, but they aren't evaluated formally, but in terms of a discussion, so to speak, and then also indicating if one of these were to occur, here's what plant features would be used to basically mitigate such an accident. So as I say, it's pretty much just a qualitative assessment of these beyond design basis events. So this discussion then necessitates the answers to two additional questions, one of which is what risk probability is society willing to accept for a very, very low frequency event such as earthquakes and tsunamis? For example, is a 1 in 500 year event acceptable? If that's acceptable, how about a 1 in 100 year event? And if 1 in 500 year event is unacceptable, how about a 1 in 1,000 year? I mean, you can go to the absolutely ridiculous with these kinds of what ifs. But those are the kinds of questions that get asked and the kinds of answers that have to be provided in some form or another. The other question is what maximum cost is society willing to incur to guarantee that only tolerable nuclear power plant damage is incurred from any conceivable risk, for example, even a meteor strike. So if society is unwilling to tolerate even very, very low probability risks to guarantee only tolerable nuclear power plant damage, then bringing all conceivable risks into the nuclear plant's design basis could ultimately mean that abundant and reliable, affordable electricity may at some point become an historical artifact. In other words, we won't build any further nuclear power plants because we just were unwilling to accept either the risk or the cost associated with preventing every risk.
Right. But then we also have to look, like you said at the beginning of our discussion, if the public is not willing to accept the risk associated with nuclear power plants, they certainly shouldn't be willing to associate the risk that comes along with any of the other sources of electricity generation, because nuclear has the best safety record, right? So if all of these things are true, why has our communication of nuclear risk been ineffective?
Very good question. And for that, I go back to the 1980s, where Peter Sandman and Vincent Cavello wrote extensively about how to effectively communicate risk to the general public. And the issue of nuclear risk communication has been a topic of discussion ever since then, with seemingly no improvement in the past 30 plus years. The question is why? Well, I believe there are three primary reasons for that. There is the persistent media anti-nuclear bias, which promotes fear of all things nuclear, also establishes false narratives, including that the nuclear industry is incompetent and has been involved in criminal cover-ups. That unfortunately is terribly wrong, but that kind of thing gets propagated in the media. And the bias in the media also inhibits the education of the public, because the public then hears a story that isn't true. Second, people are frightened by things they don't understand. That's just human nature. And lastly, fear is a highly contagious motivator. Fear is a very, very interesting phenomenon that motivates people to do things that are just, in most cases, illogical.
Right. Absolutely. So did the nuclear industry fail to effectively implement risk communication guidelines, or did guidelines just simply not work?
Yeah, and so I've asked the question, did the nuclear industry fail to effectively implement the risk communication guidelines of Sandman and Cavello, or did the guidelines just not work? And I suspect, again, this is me, I suspect the latter has brought the nuclear industry to where it is today, and that is that the guidelines just don't work. And one of the reasons I believe that is because I believe that underlying the risk communication guidelines is an assumption that the audiences for which communication is intended are rational people capable of critical thinking. And unfortunately, people are driven primarily by emotions, especially fear, and they're not rational. Also, most Americans never have been taught how to think critically about anything. We see that constantly. Yes. And unfortunately, the general public often parrots what they hear and are reluctant to admit that their beliefs may be incorrect. So I think all of those kind of come together to make whatever risk communication guidelines you're using relatively ineffective.
Right. Absolutely. And that does seem like a very huge obstacle that we need to overcome in order to gain our nation's electricity or energy independence. We are out of time right now, Jeff, and I want to have you back on to maybe talk more about what we can do to overcome all of these negative misconceptions about nuclear. But anyway, thank you very, very much for your time, and we will look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much.